everybody. Good evening. It's good to see you out there on the foggy Tuesday evening. I want to welcome you, all of you, to part one of the Tocqueville Center's February event. My name is Brent Nelson, and I'm the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society, and a professor in the Department of Politics and International Affairs. The Tocqueville Center is dedicated to exploring the big questions asked by the best minds. Sometimes that looks like a discussion of the role of competition and cooperation in the works of Alexis de Tocqueville and Charles Darwin, a discussion we had last month when we hosted Robert Putnam and Sarah Gustafson. And sometimes it looks like a discussion of the role religion plays in contemporary politics in America, which we experienced last September when Molly Worthen, Emma Green, Ryan Burge, and Eric McDaniel graced this stage. Tonight we begin a discussion of the conservative movement in the United States that will carry over into tomorrow night with a CLP event that begins at 5 p.m. Over the next two nights, we will hear from four of the most prominent conservative voices in contemporary America: Helen Andrews, David Brooks, Matthew Continetti, and Matthew Martens. Each night, two of the four speakers will make a short presentation describing the conservative landscape in the age of Trump. The presentations will be followed by a panel discussion that includes all four speakers. Our two speakers tonight are Helen Andrews and Matthew Martens. I will introduce each one now, and then they will take the stage without further introduction. Our first speaker, Helen Andrews, is a senior editor at the American Conservative. Previously, she was managing editor of the Washington Examiner magazine. She earned her BA in religious studies from Yale University. Helen is perhaps best known for two important publications. First, her stunning piece on public shaming in the internet age titled Shame Storm, which you can find in the January 2019 issue of First Things. And second, her takedown of my own generation in her beautifully written and insightful book called Boomers: The Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster. Titles that incorporate the thesis. Those are great titles. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, First Things, the Claremont Review of Books, Hedgehog Review, and many other outlets. In 2017-18, she was a Robert Novak Journalism Fellow. Our second speaker is Matthew Martens, a trial lawyer and partner at the international law firm of WilmerHale in Washington, D.C. He earned his JD at the University of North Carolina School of Law and an MS at Dallas Theological Seminary. Matt served as a law clerk to Chief Justice William Rehnquist at the U.S. Supreme Court and as a political appointee in the criminal division of the U.S. Justice Department under Attorney General John Ashcroft. He has spent the bulk of his 27-year legal career practicing criminal law both as a federal prosecutor and as a defense attorney. Recently, Matt published a major work on criminal justice reform that combines deep theological reflection, firsthand knowledge of the American criminal justice system, and a profound compassion for human beings, whether victims or perpetrators, caught in an all too often dehumanizing and unjust structure. His book is called Reforming Criminal Justice, a Christian Proposal. Now, will you join me in welcoming Helen Andrews?
Thank you, Brent, for that lovely introduction. Although seeing some boomers in the audience now, I wish I had made the title of my book a little more ambiguous. So I think the idea behind the speakers that you've selected to take part in this event is that each of us represent a different strain within the conservative movement. So tonight I'm going to use my time to talk a little bit about the strain that I represent and to explain as graciously as I can why the other side lost and my side has won. So I work for a magazine called The American Conservative. We were founded in 2003 by Pat Buchanan. At that time, as he had been during the Clinton years, Pat Buchanan was an outsider. It was a dissident tendency. And his opposition to what was then the Republican establishment focused on three main issues that he founded his magazine to represent. The first was foreign policy. If you had to put it in a sentence, you would say that Pat Buchanan founded the American Conservative to oppose the Iraq War from the right. Pat Buchanan's view was not that America should be isolationist or should have no global footprint, but he thought that the Iraq War was misconceived and that the end of the Cold War should have led to a rethinking of America's position in the world now that our biggest enemy was no longer a player on the board. The second issue was immigration. Immigration had for decades been a very strange issue within the conservative movement because the power brokers, the people in Washington and the base were utterly at odds. The Republican base was unanimous in its opposition to illegal immigration, but it had grown steadily worse, and none of the politicians in Washington seemed ever to do anything about it. And Pat Buchanan really stood for taking a stand and saying, no, illegal immigration has to stop. And by the way, we should rethink legal immigration as well. The third issue in the Buchananite policy array was trade. Trade, for those of you who don't remember the 90s, had been a major issue in the Clinton years. That decade saw two major developments that would drastically reshape America and its place in the world. The first was NAFTA, which Pat Buchanan was one of the few on the right to oppose at the time. It was the first trade agreement ever signed between a first world country and a third world country. So it was the first time that American workers had been exposed, utterly exposed, to competition from third world wages. And it went about as well as you might expect. And then later, of course, the effects of NAFTA were dwarfed by the China shock, granting China permanent normal trade relations and then ushering them into the WTO. China, as we've seen, grew into a manufacturing titan, while in America, manufacturing employment utterly collapsed. And as I mention the trade issue, because foreshadowing it's going to be important to the second half of the story, it's important to clarify that there are two reasons why Pat Buchanan and people like me who agree with him are worried about the free trade maximalism that prevailed in the 90s. Total free trade is bad if it leads to a decline in manufacturing. One, because it's bad for the workers. If a factory moves from Ohio to China, there are people who have lost jobs, and that's bad for them. And that's a policy harm that needs to be addressed. But the second is it's bad for everybody. Even if you don't work in manufacturing, living in a country that has a strong manufacturing base is good. It means that you don't have hollowed out cities in entire states that are falling into economic disrepair. It also means that the manufacturing innovations of the future are going to happen on your soil and not in China or in South Korea. Innovation tends to follow where the actual manufacturing takes place, because that's where people learn new ways of doing things. And then thirdly, it's bad for everybody because as we saw during COVID, the globalized market is actually a lot more precarious and fragile than we imagined. And in a crisis, we cannot always depend on global supply chains. So having things made here and continuing to make stuff in America is valuable and something that we should protect. That, of course, was not the view of the Republican establishment in the 90s or in the George W. Bush years. Those were the years of Republicans who said, whether you make potato chips or computer chips, what's the difference? GDP is GDP. So today, in 2003, my magazine just celebrated its 20-year anniversary. 20 years ago, the Buchananite constellation of views on those three issues, foreign policy, immigration, and trade in China, were in the minority. Today, 20 years later, that has changed. And I'm able to stand up here and be rather a little bit smug about my side having won the argument and won over the party. And the question, what happened, has a two-word answer. And the two words are Donald Trump. Just as Barry Goldwater famously paved the way for the Reagan victory a generation later, Pat Buchanan and the groundwork that he laid in the 1990s really set up Donald Trump and his historic victory in 2016. And I'm happy to say, now that we have the record of a Buchananite president in office to look at, his ideas have been vindicated, which of course is why he's been a lock for the nomination the second time around. Foreign policy. The skeptics of the Iraq War have, unfortunately, in the 2 decades since that conflict, had many new wars to be skeptical of all over again. Because unfortunately, the people who go around involving the U.S. in these conflicts have not tired or rested. Donald Trump was the one who came into office and said, bringing Georgia into NATO, probably a bad idea. Bringing Ukraine into NATO, probably a bad idea. Although I think, as we saw, I said earlier that Buchanan was not an isolationist, and I don't think Trump was either. He just was skeptical of the people who had led the Republican Party astray on foreign policy for so long. Immigration, it was a centerpiece of Trump's campaign, just as it was for Pat Buchanan in the 1990s, and it was one of the biggest sources of his popularity. For a long time, Republican voters had been told by the people that they voted for in Washington, yes, of course we agree with you, illegal immigration is bad, but there's just, there's a limit to how much we can do about it. Nothing can be done. The people are coming over the border. A wall's not going to work. Immigration restrictionists in the voting base had been sort of inundated with arguments of futility. We would love to help you, but there's nothing we can do. So one of the biggest services Donald Trump performed is proving those people wrong, that they were lying all the time. There were lots of things they could have done to reduce illegal immigration, and Donald Trump came and did them, and it worked. Remain in Mexico was a successful policy. And also, the other big warning that had always prevented conservative politicians from taking action on immigration the way their voters wanted them to was the threat that it would be toxic in elections. This was the message of the famous RNC autopsy report. You can't go hard on the immigration issue because you will alienate voters. We need to prepare the Republican Party for a more diverse America. Therefore, we can't act on illegal immigration now. Well, Donald Trump picked up votes among Hispanic voters between 2016 and 2020. So I hope that has put to bed the idea that taking a stand for the rule of law is necessarily toxic to a Republican candidate. And then, of course, the third Buchananite policy pillar is trade. And when the people that I went to school with are all, insanely liberal. There were not that many conservatives where I went. But when I talked to them, these people who have all gone on to work at the DNC, some of them, and I asked them, is there anything about Trump that you like? Is there any achievement he had that you will give him credit for? The one that they all say that I hear most often from them is China. He really woke up America and the political class on China. If Trump hadn't won in 2016, I think there's a good chance that both parties would have continued on autopilot, the same lines that were recited during the George Bush years of yes, we need to help China. The richer they get, the more democratic they'll get. We need to do nice things for them. We're converging. And it was Donald Trump who really made it okay to say, no, that hasn't worked out. The rosy promises of the Clinton years haven't been borne out by events. China is a threat, and we need to treat them like one. Trump did not always do great in the personnel department, but one of his inspired choices was Robert Lighthizer as U.S. Trade Representative. Bob Lighthizer, if you don't know his name, has been involved in this issue for decades. Nobody's thought more deeply about trade than he has, and he's firmly in the Buchananite camp. So Donald Trump pretty much put him in office and let him go nuts and fulfill every policy dream he'd been thinking up for decades, and it actually turned out rather well. So to reach the final third of my remarks and start circling in for a landing, when Donald Trump lost in 2020, I was personally worried. The question in my mind at that time was, is the party just going to go back to the way it was before? Is everybody in power just going to pretend that 2016 never happened? We're going to go back to being the party of George Bush and Mitt Romney and pretend that was all just a big hallucination. The years since then have reassured me that that is not going to happen, that we are not going to revert to the status quo that was failing the right and failing America. Nikki Haley, I'm sorry to say this, in her home state, is going nowhere. The party is Donald Trump's party, and I think the House Speaker shakeup reflects that. So it's very important to me that continue to be the case. Right now, I'm optimistic that this will continue to be Donald Trump's party, and that the future belongs to people like J.D. Vance, who have all of the great, brilliant ideas of Trumpism without a lot of the baggage that apparently annoys so many people. So I'm confident that that's the way things are trending. But I really do want to emphasize to all of you here that it's important that happen. We need to make sure we don't revert to the status quo of yesteryear, because the real difference between people who support Trump and his policy agenda now and the people who don't and went the never Trump path is that those people refuse to learn from new facts. They just refuse to learn the lessons of history, and particularly the lessons of the last 30 years of history. On trade, for example, I've actually talked to libertarian economists, Cato Institute type people, George Mason University type people, and I've said to them, okay, I understand being against decoupling from China now, because if you think we're too deep in it, we're too entwined, we can't withdraw from China without completely destroying our own economy, so we just have to make the best of the situation as it is. I can understand that point of view. But tell me honestly, when you look back at the 90s and the decisions that were made then, can you identify any mistakes? Is there anything you wish you had done differently? The China shock that decimated the Midwest, was that really inevitable? Or could you maybe have averted that? And these libertarian economists say, no, China's rise was inevitable. Nothing we could have done to stop it. So, yeah, we basically should have done what we did. I identify no mistakes. That to me is just shocking to hear someone look at the effects of the China shock now and the collapse of American manufacturing and say, yep, that went about as planned. It's just absurd to me. Or foreign policy. That's the last to close. I'll close on that one because that is the issue that is nearest and dearest to the heart of the magazine I work for. It's the centerpiece of our mission. It's gratifying now to be vindicated on the folly of the Iraq War. Most people nowadays agree with us and say we were right, and George Bush should have listened to us and not AEI at the time. But it's as nice as it is to have people agree with you 20 years too late, I would much rather have them agree with me on decisions that we're making now. And it's frustrating to see so many people who will agree that the Iraq War was foolish, but then say, "Oh yeah, but we got to send maximum aid to Ukraine. We got to stop Putin. Yep, let's get as involved in Ukraine as we need to be. Ramp up, ramp up." So to see the same people making the same mistakes over and over again over the course of decades really makes me personally feel alienated from the movement that I've devoted my professional life to. So I would like to vote for a party that makes me proud and makes America a better place. I would like to work for a movement that makes America a better place. And that's only going to happen if we embrace the Buchananite pillars that he was right about in his lonely battle, Pat Buchanan, lo these many decades ago now. And it took a long time for people to come around to his point of view. But as Donald Trump showed, they really have, and there's no going back. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Helen. That gave me lots to think about. Interestingly, what this presidency has given us a new focus on is the criminal law. Whether it's the indictments against Donald Trump or the indictments of January 6th protesters, it's been interesting to me to see conservatives with a renewed focus on what they see now as a criminal justice system run amok, being used for illegitimate purposes. And to Helen's point, I would say that was a lesson that we should have learned 200 years ago at the founding, but that we've abandoned in the meantime. So as I was thinking about my remarks tonight, I looked up the definition of a conservative in the Encyclopedia Britannica. It defines conservatism as a political philosophy that seeks to promote and preserve traditional institutions and practices. Or as Russell Kirk puts it, conservatism adheres to custom, convention, and continuity. When it comes to criminal law, however, to be a conservative, at least for a good period of time and maybe even continuing, was to be tough on crime. Rather than adhering to our constitutional tradition of limiting the power of the state when it exercises that most awesome power to prosecute and punish a citizen by means of physically coercive force, what passed for conservatism for too long, and perhaps even still does, has given too little regard to our tradition of constitutional restraints on government, and instead affords extraordinary deference to law enforcement. I could point to a number of examples about and features of our criminal justice system to make that point, but I'll focus tonight on just two, on bail and how it relates to plea bargaining. Today, reducing pretrial detention, meaning reducing the number of people who are jailed prior to trial and affording more generous pretrial bail, whether that's through the elimination of cash bail or the establishment of bail funds, is a position generally associated with progressives, while so-called conservatives tend to support pretrial detention, meaning jailing people before their guilt has ever been determined. But that wasn't the view of the founders, whose tradition conservatives claim to be preserving. The Constitution's Eighth Amendment, by its plain terms, prohibits excessive bail. Professor Kellen Funk of Columbia Law School and a graduate of Bob Jones University here in Greenville, and Professor Sandra Mason of the University of Pennsylvania recently penned an article soon to be published in the Harvard Law Review, arguing that the contemporary conservative aversion to bail and support of pretrial detention is inconsistent with the founding era attitude. I'm always amused when I see on my Twitter feed references to the January 6th DC Gulag. Apparently everyone's now coming around to this notion. In the article by Mason and Funk, in an article entitled Bail at the Founding, they argue that, quote, the black letter law of bail in the founding era was highly protective of pretrial liberty. As Funk and Mason explain, quote, nearly all accused people at the founding had the right to release on bail, and bail was carefully calibrated to defendants' financial circumstances. They go on to explain in this article that even when bail was required, it was not the cash bail that's so common today, but rather merely a pledge to pay. Examining the historical record, Funk and Mason conclude, quote, there is no indication that any accused person or surety was ever required to produce cash or collateral as a condition for the accused person's release. Did I mention Kellen Funk has a PhD in American history from Princeton? He concludes, quote, there is no American tradition of cash bail that dates to the founding era. No tradition. Compare that to the prevailing situation today. In 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled for the first time, in 1987, 200 years, more than 200 years after the founding, that bail was permissible not only to ensure a defendant's appearance at trial, but also because of the defendant's supposed future dangerousness. Having not been convicted of even the crime charged, the court ruled a defendant could be detained for fear of other crimes he might commit. In the 37 years since that ruling, the lower courts have gone hog wild, gorging themselves on pretrial detention. Now, on any given day, not just in the wake of January 6th, about 500,000 people are detained prior to trial in the United States, 3/4 of them for traffic offenses, property crimes, and drug possession. People, again, who've been convicted of nothing. Exacerbating this deviation from our Constitution's tradition of generous bail and regular pretrial release is the modern abandonment of the Constitution's guarantee to a speedy trial. In early America, not only was pretrial release the norm, but trials tended to be held quite quickly. But in 1972, the Supreme Court was presented with a case involving a more than 5-year delay between a defendant's arrest and his trial on a murder charge. Though the justices thought it a, quote, close case, they unanimously concluded that the defendant's speedy trial right was not violated by that delay. 5 years is speedy enough, they said. In the years since, again, not surprising, lower courts regularly find that lengthy delays in getting to trial don't violate the speedy trial right. It's very common for criminal defendants to sit in jail for years awaiting trial. In 2013, the Houston Chronicle reported on the cases of dozens of defendants who languished in jail, local jails for years, in some instances up to 8 years, awaiting trial. In 2005, the Mississippi Supreme Court ruled that a 4-year delay in bringing a defendant's case to trial following indictment and arrest did not violate the speedy trial right because the court, quote, does not recognize as prejudice the negative emotional, social, and economic impacts on the defendant's life resulting from pretrial detention. In 2013, a California appellate court ruled that it didn't violate the speedy trial right to jail a defendant for 7 years before trial, despite, quote, the oppressive nature of pretrial incarceration and the anxiety it produces. In 2020, a Massachusetts court appellate court said 5 years of pretrial detention was no speedy trial violation. In 2014, the New York appellate court said 1.5 years was no speedy trial violation. In 2019, a Washington state court acquitted at trial a man after he spent 8 years at trial in detention prior to trial, unable to make bail. As a federal appeals court in Chicago summed it up, quote, significant pretrial incarceration does not alone make out a deprivation of the right to a speedy trial. Say what? What tradition supports that nonsense? But assuming you endure lengthy pretrial detention without bail, at least you'll finally get your day in court, right? You'll actually get a trial, won't you? Hardly. The criminal jury trial is largely extinct in the United States, having been killed off by prosecutors who want to avoid accountability for their charging decisions and want to escape the restraints of prosecutorial budgets that should be a normal part, that were a traditional part of any justice system. Nothing about that is conservative. The British denial of the right to the jury trial was one of the colonists' grievances against King George III that's recited in the Declaration of Independence. In fact, so central was the jury trial right to the founders that it's the only right that appears twice in the U.S. Constitution, both in Article 3 and in the Seventh Amendment. As Thomas Jefferson observed, I consider the trial by jury as the only anchor yet imagined by man by which a government can be held to the principles of its constitution. And yet today, approximately 95% of criminal cases and criminal convictions are the result not of trials, but of plea bargaining. How do you get 95% of people to give up a constitutional right to a jury trial? The answer is coercion. Through excessive or outright denial of bail, disregard of the speedy trial right, and judicially sanctioned enhanced sentences for those who insist on a trial, prosecutors can coerce guilty pleas out of people. By locking people up before they're convicted, particularly when it's minor charges, and then offering them plea bargains and promises of time served on if they plead guilty, or threats of long delays awaiting that so-called speedy trial, and threats of far more severe sentences if they're convicted after those trials, prosecutors can and do coerce people into giving up the jury trial right and instead pleading guilty. And it's not my speculation that the denial of bail coerces guilty pleas. We have a recent study to prove it. Recently, because of a consent decree entered into Houston, challenging the bail system in Harris County, Texas, data was collected that allowed researchers from the University of Pennsylvania to look at 380,000 criminal cases, 190,000 of them before the consent decree, 190,000 of them after the consent decree. And what that study, released by the University of Pennsylvania researchers in August of 2022, showed is that increasing the availability of pretrial release reduces by 17% the number of defendants who get convicted. To put a finer point on it, what the study showed is that when the prosecution had to prove its case, rather than coerce people into guilty pleas by lengthy pretrial detention, the prosecution turned out to be unable to make its case 1 out of every 6 times. The National Registry of Exonerations, maintained by the University of Michigan, reports that since 1989, 24% of exonerations, meaning people we later learned had not committed the crime, 24% of exonerations were people who pled guilty. Duke Law professor Brandon Garrett did a study of the first 250 people exonerated by DNA technology. And of those 250 people, people we know to a scientific certainty did not commit the crime. 6.5% had pled guilty. What exactly are we conserving? What tradition are we maintaining with that type of criminal justice system? What it seems like we're conserving is precisely what the American colonists went to war over, and what we sought to prevent from happening again by the very terms of the U.S. Constitution. I should conclude. When it comes to criminal justice, the order and justice and freedom, to use Russell Kirk's words, enshrined in our Constitution, were the products of long social experience, the result of centuries of trial, reflection, and sacrifice. The colonists, having learned hard lessons from the experience with English rule, quite literally gave their lives to ensure our right to be imprisoned, if at all, only after a trial presided over by an impartial judge upon the verdict of a jury of our peers. The founders understood the need, especially when it came to criminal justice, for, quote, prudent restraints on power and upon human passions to avoid both anarchy and tyranny. Again, quoting Russell Kirk. Our criminal justice system today is a dramatic departure from those ideals, a repudiation of that constitutional tradition. And the result is both anarchy and tyranny, uncontrolled crime in too many cities, including the one where I live and work, and the effective denial of the criminal jury trial nationwide. Labeling that supposed tough-on-crime system as conservative is a tyrannical sleight of hand of anti-historic proportions. Too many people fall for that linguistic trick, I fear, because the impact of the system falls on people not like them, until it does. But the hard-fought lesson of history is that tyranny against others might one day be turned on you. The lawfare we now see being waged as a means of politics should alert us to the fact that that day might have already arrived. Regardless, whenever that day comes, you'll wish you conserved this system, forged from the long social experience of trial, reflection, and sacrifice. So let's conserve it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen and Matt. And I'll invite the remainder of the panel to come on up here while I give you, while I introduce everyone to you. And while they're coming up, you know, I just got to think that if I were like Rip Van Winkle and I had gone to sleep in, say, 2010, and I woke up today in what is supposedly a panel on conservatism in America, and I heard about staying out of international conflicts, being tough on the border, and what was the other one? Oh, trade. You know, we shouldn't be free traders anymore, and we don't really need to be tough on crime anymore. I would have thought something really has gone wrong with the conservative movement. I mean, it's completely different, right? And that's why we're here. We want to talk about some of these changes that you've already heard displayed for us. This is really, really good. So let me introduce the two that have come to the podium, to the stage. David Brooks, to my left here, next to Helen, writes a weekly opinion column for the New York Times and is a Friday political commentator for PBS NewsHour. He earned his BA from the University of Chicago. David is a journalist by trade, but, in my opinion, a frustrated social scientist by temperament. His columns and his books are filled with insights from his reading of psychologists, sociologists, economists, and political scientists in the best scholarly journals and professional substacks. Nowhere is this better displayed than in his recently published bestseller, How to Know a Person: The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. There he draws on seminal works in psychology to teach us how to connect deeply with other persons in an atomizing society. And our second panelist, next to David, is Matthew Continetti, who is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies and the inaugural Patrick and Charlene Neal Chair in American Prosperity at the American Enterprise Institute. He earned his BA in History from Columbia University. Like most of our panelists, Matthew works as a journalist. He was the founding editor and the editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon. He is also a contributing editor at National Review and a columnist for Commentary magazine. In addition, he has been published in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. But Matthew is also a scholar focused on American political thought and history. He is the author of 3 books, including The K Street Gang, The Rise and Fall of the Republican Machine, The Persecution of Sarah Palin, How the Elite Media Tried to Bring Down a Rising Star, and most recently his magisterial The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism. So please give our panelists a hand as we welcome them. So first, David Brooks, how do you react to these 2 talks about conservatism that, in my opinion, sound very progressive?
Surrounded by the left.
You do have a mic there, and I sure hope they work.
And it seems to be...
It needs to be turned on, I think. Try that.
There we go. First, let me start with Matt, since I think Helen and the 2 of us are probably going to get into it a little more. I found your presentation extremely compelling, and it's a subject I knew nothing about. And it seems like that moment when I realized the death penalty really is a bad idea. I don't know if you share that opinion, but yeah. But my one question, and really this is way above my pay grade, I just want to know how the courts think about this question. Early in my career, I was a police reporter in Chicago. And so I covered a lot of crime, a lot of rape, a lot of murder. And a lot of the people I covered had long rap sheets. They were extremely violent with a history of violence. They were often a threat to their spouses and girlfriends. How do we think about dangerous people in this circumstance?
So I think that what I'm arguing for is exactly, in some ways, the solution to that issue. When I go out talking about this, I actually have a longer discussion about plea bargaining. And what I always argue is that everybody, I don't care what your politics on the left and the right, should hate American-style plea bargaining. Because the way it operates is either by threatening unjustly long sentences or, far more frequently, offering unjustly lenient sentences. And so the reality of what actually happened is obscured. And what the person actually did is never addressed. I had somebody just recently, a friend, call me, long story why, but he brought to my attention someone who had been charged with a rape and had pled guilty to a misdemeanor assault. And he asked me, so what happened? And I said, that's an excellent question. And we don't know because our plea bargaining system lies to us about what actually happened. And so either this person committed a rape for which they should have been punished quite severely, or they didn't. And the way we answer those questions in America is have 12 average citizens hear the evidence. And instead, the way we resolved this was through a secret negotiation that ultimately means either the original charge was a lie or the plea was a lie. And more likely than not, the plea was a lie that allowed that person to never receive the discipline of the system. And you're exactly right. When I was a prosecutor, we'd show up in court and people that have 20 prior convictions, dozens of prior arrests. And the system kept cycling them through rather than actually speak the truth about what they did by adhering to our constitutional system of putting it to a jury. Instead, somehow the courts blessed this notion of negotiating lies about what happened. And I think that contributes to the situation we're in, particularly, one last comment, because we know that most crime is committed by a very small number of people, and that we could address the issue if we'd actually address that small number of people, but our system doesn't do that.
So, David, you want a second question here?
Well,
Sure,
I have a counter narrative.
Okay, counter near.
And so one thing Helen and I agree on is that her team won. And I'm too old to see the reconstitution of the Republican Party along my lines, which is why I switched teams. No, kidding. But I'll tell a different narrative. And so I have a book over in my backpack over there, which is called Snowflake, which is a biography of Warren Buffett. And it contains in that biography a lot of discussion of Warren Buffett's dad, Howard Buffett. Howard Buffett was a 4-term Republican congressman from Nebraska in the 1930s and 40s. And Howard Buffett was a very pessimistic guy. He bought a farm because he thought America was being ruined by Washington, and he needed someplace where he could feed his family while the rest of the world starved. He believed all government bonds would be of zero value because we were destroying the credibility of the United States. FDR was. He believed, he bought his daughters, he gave them gold instead of cash gifts because he thought the US dollar would be worth it. And so that was a moment of he was a guy of extreme pessimism. But he was a Republican at a time when the Republican Party was a party of extreme pessimism. And extreme pessimism tends to show up in 3 ways: nativism, isolationism, and protectionism. And sure enough, the Republican Party in the 1930s and 1940s was an isolationist party. It was the America First Party, the slogan that Donald Trump picked up on. It was the party of Robert Taft a little later, who was against, I believe he was against NATO. He was against the World Bank. He was against the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which was the WTO before its time. And so he was pretty against the sort of international system as was emerging mostly after the war. So that was the isolationist side. Of course, there was also America First, the people who didn't want to enter World War II. Howard Buffett thought that FDR and George C. Marshall had engineered the attack on Pearl Harbor and opposed the entry into World War II even after Pearl Harbor, which I think other isolationists did. And then, of course, it was also a nativist party. It was the party that shut down immigration in the 1920s. And so that was a party of very different from the Republican Party I grew up in. And that party was changed in my story by Dwight Eisenhower. And one of the nice things about Matt's book is Ronald Reagan's not the total center of the story, but Dwight Eisenhower took a party that was extremely inward-looking and pessimistic, and he made it an outward-looking and optimistic party. He had a great deal of confidence in himself, a great deal of confidence in American power and the ability to extend American power. He had just won World War II, after all. And so he defeats Taft, the isolationist, and my buddy, Howard Buffett, decides as a congressman, he can't endorse the Republican nominee. And so he will not endorse Eisenhower. And so his wing of the party is basically destroyed by Eisenhower. And the Republican Party becomes the Republican Party that I sort of grew up in, which is internationalist, believing in more or less free trade, and in believing in legal immigration. And that becomes the party of Ronald Reagan, who's super optimistic and super confident in American ability. That becomes the party of the Bushes and Romney and McCain. And it produces, to my mind, a lot of good things. So it produces, I was in the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union collapsed. It produces the international order that destroys Soviet communism. It creates the international order that creates the vast spread of democracy, often in the 1990s. It produces the international order that helps end apartheid in South Africa. And so we saw in those years a vast spread of democracy around the world, in my view, because of the liberal American-led order, and a period of relative peace. It also, in a mostly free market country, saw the vast spread of prosperity, the greatest reduction in poverty in human history globally. I think Helen, I think I disagree with your economics. I think if you look at deindustrialization, that was mostly a 1970s thing and not a 1990s thing. And so the 90s was a period of widening or shrinking inequality, of real wage growth, of pretty good economy. People reelected Bill Clinton for a reason. And it was a Republican Party that, while opposing illegal immigration, was happy to see America become a diverse place and the crossroads of the talented in the world. Then something bad happened to my version of the Republican Party. And I would say a couple of things happened. One, the financial crisis delegitimized capitalism for a lot of people. Two, the Iraq War was a mistake. Three, and this is my core story of why populism has risen around the world, a highly educated group of Americans married each other, created children who were also highly educated, who also married each other. They moved to the same 12 cities, Denver, LA, New York, Denver, or wherever, Washington, and they basically created an inherited meritocratic class. And 80% of America looked at those people who dominate the media. In my newspaper, more than half the writers come from the same 26 colleges. And they said those people have too much power. They have too much money. They have too much cultural influence. And by the way, they look down on me. And that would be my story for the rise of Trump. I don't think it was as neat a story as the dispassionate view of foreign policy, trade policy, and immigration policy, although I agree with it. So to get back to the mistakes that Helen talked about, I agree. I was for the Iraq War because I was actually there when Soviet communism fell. I was actually there when apartheid fell. I was actually there when Central Europe was liberated. And I saw the spread of democracy as a foreign correspondent, and I thought, why not the Middle East? And that turned out to be a mistake for a bunch of reasons. But I guess my reaction was, okay, that was a mistake. But the liberation of Poland, of Estonia, of the Czech Republic, these were not mistakes, and they were done by the liberal international order. Second, I agree that the hollowing out of American industry was also a mistake. And that has caused me to not turn Trumpy, because I don't think he's capable of doing anything about it. But it has caused me to become a supporter of Joe Biden. And so one of my heroes is a philosopher named Isaiah Berlin. And Isaiah Berlin said he was happy to be on the rightward edge of the leftward tendency. And I figure if it's good enough for Isaiah Berlin, it's good enough for me. And so I define the rightward edge of the Democratic coalition. And I think my guy Biden, who may be old and doddering, not as old and doddering as he looks on TV, by the way, has done the things that Donald Trump promised to do, but was too incompetent to do. So the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Act, the IRA, we now have, everywhere I go around the country, I was just in Dayton, Ohio, there's a Micron chip plant being built. I was in Appalachian, Ohio, there's an Intel plant being built. Manufacturing is coming back in part because it was sparked by these three measures that Joe Biden passed. And so I acknowledge some of the arguments that Helen makes about some of the failures over the last 10 years, but it's driven me a little left and not a little right. So that's my counter narrative.
Great. Well, Helen, you get the next shot. So, why did his side lose so badly? Sounds pretty good.
Well, I don't even know if it's his side. I feel like David just conceded the correctness of Trumpism on the merits on a lot of the issues. So I feel pretty good about that.
I would say that what I think we've returned to is the pessimist, nativist, isolationist, and protectionist Republican Party of the 1920s and 1930s. And the internationalist party that I thought I saw has turned out to be a parenthesis in history. And thus I view the Trump movement and the populism that he represents a little less attractively than you do.
When I hear my Republican Party described as pessimistic, I'm not even mad. I'm just confused. I honestly believe that there is not a more optimistic human being alive on the planet right now than Donald J. Trump. Have you seen him?
It's American carnage?
It's
the
his
Flight 93 election?
Make America great again? No, I believe Trumpism is the only strain in politics right now that actually believes in America and Americans. It's the other guys who say, yeah, China took all our manufacturing. Well, that's just how comparative advantage works, baby. They're just better at it. than we are. It is America's fate to be a second-rate power and not have a manufacturing base. We just don't measure up in the globalized economy. Sorry. Or they're the people who look at STEM PhD departments, grad students in American universities. A lot of the science and STEM fields, those graduate departments are 75% foreign students, some of them more than that. They say, yeah, of course we need to import grad students from around the world. We couldn't possibly train Americans to be grad students in electrical engineering. I'm the one saying, well, actually, no. I think we should have graduate departments in STEM fields dominated by American citizens at American universities. They're the ones who say we need high-skilled immigration to found the companies of tomorrow. I think Americans can do that. I think we're pretty capable. So when I look around for optimism, I see it on my side and not a lot of other places.
Okay, well, Matthew Continetti, it's your turn.
Thank you, Brent, and thank you all for having me here. I will also start with Matt Martens' presentation, which I also thought was very enlightening, very interesting. Not sure I totally agree with it, but what I did agree with was the sense that every argument was grounded in the American founding and in the American political tradition and in the Constitution and in the ideas that informed the revolution. And this is important to me because it speaks to the Americanness of American conservatism. We always ask what defines American conservatism, and in my view, it's the modifier, not the noun. And what's American about American conservatism is the American founding. And so while other conservatives and other conservatisms tend to defend inherited traditions that include monarchies, that include aristocracies, that include established churches, we do not have that in the United States of America. We have a constitution preceded by a declaration. And when I study the history of American conservatism in the 20th century and in the 21st, in the main, most conservatives have always grounded their arguments toward the origin. That's why you see 1776 so prominent in conservative discourse today. That's why constitutional originalism is triumphant today. And so I really appreciated that about your talk. I also appreciated the fact that you had facts and academic citations. And it's so rare in political discourse today. So I was really impressed by all of your research. And I'll do a lot of studying tonight before my talk tomorrow to incorporate that. A little bit about the first presentation. Listening to it, I was transported back to May 2003. And when George W. Bush traveled to the aircraft carrier and declared the end of combat operations in Iraq with the banner that read above him, "Mission accomplished." And so I guess I disagree with both Helen and David because I don't actually think the Buchanan-Trump side has won. I think a lot is still up for grabs in the Republican Party. And I don't think the Trumpism has proven to be a very effective political vehicle for the GOP. Just a couple of notes on the factual elements. You hear this reference to the collapse in American manufacturing. I just think we should be more specific. It's not American manufacturing that's collapsed. American manufacturing employment has been drastically reduced. But of course, that is also the case globally. And if we had been alive in the 1920s, we'd be hearing about the collapse in American agriculture. I think less than 1% of Americans are involved in agricultural work today, and yet America continues to feed not only ourselves, but the rest of the world. And so the American manufacturing base is actually quite strong. Its production is up. It's just that it's not maybe doing the things that we always wanted to do, and the defense industrial base, the manufacturers that are involved in the production of armaments, that has been depleted. And that needs to be restored, and I think there's a consensus throughout conservatives that needs to be restored. A reference to the fact that everyone now agrees that the war in Iraq was a mistake. I agree that that's the case when you look at polls of Americans. They look back at that conflict and think it was a mistake. But I have to say, and this is one of my own the facts and citations, I was a little bit surprised last March, the 20th anniversary of the Iraq invasion, the second Iraq invasion. Axios ran a poll showing that Republican voters were split on the question of whether the Iraq war was worth it. And a slight majority of Republicans said it was worth it 20 years after. Now, that's not the overwhelming number of Republicans that thought the Iraq war was a good idea at the time or even up until about 2015. But it's still interesting, I think, that the battle of ideas has not been won lopsidedly. So about Trump, just for a second, I think, as David alluded to, we sometimes give Trump too much intellectual coherence. For me, fundamentally, Donald Trump is a performer, and he's a brilliant performer. He has two modes. He has the gangster bully, and he has the comic lover. That's it. He does one or the other. So when he's threatening the NATO countries that he's going to let Russia invade them, he's the gangster bully. But when he's up on stage talking about how he loves Hillary now, it's no longer crooked Hillary. He moved crooked over to Biden. Now it's beautiful Hillary. That was him in this state, I think, just a few days ago. Everyone's laughing because he's the comic lover. Those are his two modes. It's true that he has attitudes and sentiments, among them a real zero-sum attitude toward international trade. And for 40 years, he's been on the record saying that other countries are ripping us off in trade and also ripping us off in our bases. He's always wanted more money for the bases, which figures because he's a landlord, right? That's Donald Trump. Ideology is not the same as Buchanan, and in some ways it's actually an insult to Pat Buchanan to liken him to Trump or to say that there's a direct link between the two. Of course, when Donald Trump ran for president the first time in 2000 as the Reform Party candidate, he called Buchanan many nasty words and ran against Buchanan. And Buchanan won that nomination and then caused George W. Bush to win the election in 2000. So really, who's to blame here? And because Trump is a performer, I think it's very hard to ground an ideological movement in a personality. I think we have to always distinguish between Trump and the people who have theorized about Trumpism. They're two different things. And oftentimes Trump goes in one direction and all the Trumpists are like, no, 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 we're over here, right? That's what happens when you have a charismatic leader like Donald Trump. And we see his predecessors in history. American populism is as old as this country. It's as old as that political tradition. And what I've found in my study of history is that when a movement based on personality, when that personality goes away, so does this movement. And Trump is winning right now. He's taken over the Republican Party. I agree with that because he's still here. He's not going to go away. He won't go away. One day, unless that deal with the devil he made was really long-lasting, he won't be here. And I think the debate will be not as clean-cut as we suggest. So finally, though, I would just say this coalition, this Trump movement, is very good, as has been explained, at winning Republican primaries. Okay, Donald Trump is about to be nominated for the GOP presidential nomination for the third time. There hasn't been a non-Trump nominee in over 12 years, right? 2012 was the last non-Trump nominee. It's the Trump party. But what has that meant for the Republican Party as a political institution? Well, there I think the jury is out. It is true Trump won by the skin of his teeth in 2016, but he also oversaw the loss of the Republican House in 2018, the loss of the Republican Senate in 2020, and he lost his office by the skin of his teeth in 2020. And then in 2022, the candidates who were picked by Trump because of their agreement with the lie that he won in 2020, they lost. And they prevented the House from winning, the House Republicans from winning a substantive majority. And they contributed to the loss of Republican governorships and the loss of Republican state legislative houses. So I don't think necessarily Trump winning is a good thing for the Republican Party or for American conservatism or the American political tradition. Thank you.
So I'll throw this out to anybody who really cares to take it up. But I'm wondering if there is a political party that is considered conservative. I mean, is there a political vehicle for conservatism? Now, I know Helen has already answered that question for herself, but I guess I'm wondering about some of the other ideas that have always been conservative, at least in the late 20th and early 21st century. And is there a political vehicle for that set of ideas in America today?
I'm going to give a more theoretical what I think real conservatism is tomorrow.
Yeah.
But I would say Trumpism is not particularly conservative. It's more reactionary. And it's reactionary against diversity. It's reactionary against, as I said, the educated elite. And it's partly a status perception that the prestige in America has flown to highly cognitive precincts. I mean, the major divide in American politics is no longer over income, it's over education levels. Mm-hmm. And Trump does very well among high school educated people who feel that they used to be accorded respect in the society, and they rightfully believe some of that respect has been taken away and been replaced by scorn. And so I think his party is more a reaction to that and has less to do with Edmund Burke. When I got to Washington, people wore, Adam Smith neckties, Tocqueville neckties, maybe some Edmund Burke neckties, I hope. I don't see much Trumpism in that. And when I look at the Heritage Foundation, I don't see much intellectual weight there. And I do think maybe with that they think they're about to run the next Trump administration, but they're about to be grievously disappointed. But if I could take one way to disagree with that on why I do think the old establishment Republicanism is doomed, at least for historical periods. The switch to a sense of American decline in the Republican Party, that happened 2009, 2013. If you look at the polling data, is America a country in decline? Are we too broke to afford international? Are we too woke? All that decline of pessimism, that preceded Trump. And it accompanied the 2013 period where you saw global populism rise around the world. Mm-hmm. And so Trump was playing into something that was already pre-existing. And so that's the reason I think the things that produce Trump are not going to go away anytime soon. And we may not get a Trump, but we'll get a J.D. Vance or we'll get a Ted Cruz or something. And it will look pretty Trumpy.
Matt, Martens, you haven't said anything in a bit. Do you have something you want to add to this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, to answer that question, I sort of have a couple thoughts. One, I don't think that there's a vehicle right now for conservatism. I think that the divide, maybe to build on David's point, is more identitarian. I mean, you see this in things like, there's all this talk about how evangelicals vote. But when you dig down and scratch beneath the surface of who's identifying as an evangelical, 14% of Muslims in a poll I looked at this week, 12% of Hindus, 5% of Jews, 2% of atheists and agnostics are identifying as evangelical. So you see that that label has become, it's an identitarian marker. It's us against whoever we want to, the godless, globalist, elite, urban, other. And I think in the same way, conservatism is, again, to the extent it's being invoked, it's an identitarian marker. It's not an actual ideological marker. I don't doubt that Helen shares those views. I don't think any of those views are what are motivating the people I know in rural areas. Immigration, perhaps. But I think it's much more, it feels to me a much more sort of identitarian, are you one of us or are you one of them, as opposed to an ideological, which is what I mean by conservative driven movement.
Okay, let's open it up to you, the audience. I would like you to raise your hand to be recognized. Please stand up. It's a big enough room. We kind of need to hear, and somebody will be coming around with a microphone. And then please keep your comments short and your questions to the point. And if you do have a person up here that you would like to address the question to, be clear on that as well. So Chris over here has a microphone, and I think Colin is the first up.
Hi, this is for Mr. Continetti. I was thinking about what you said earlier during your talk about you were skeptical of the endurance of Trumpism, correct? My question for you is, we've seen in other countries similar political, if you want to call it that, political movements coming about, centering around one sort of personality. They tend not to go away. We take, for example, Fujimorism in Peru, where you have Keiko Fujimori, who, I think it was in 2022, she lost this big deal, right? Alberto Fujimori was president of Peru in the 1990s. And this movement is still very much alive on Peruvian rights. So how can you respond to that? Just
Well, what I think you're describing is a political dynasty, right? And indeed, one reason Trump became president was he had the good fortune to run against two political dynasties, two unpopular political dynasties. He ran against the Bush dynasty in the Republican primary in 2016, and then he ran against the Clinton dynasty in the general election. I think that if what you can see, very clearly by Trump's moves to take over the Republican National Committee, is his attempt to engineer another family dynasty. Irony of history, that the great populist is actually trying to create a family dynasty to outlast him once he departs the stage. But I liken Trump to a figure like Huey Long. Okay, Huey Long was the most powerful person in Louisiana. He was a major figure in American politics. He set up the Share Our Wealth organization. And when he was killed, his number two, his protege, tried to take it over. It didn't work. And so, Trump could create a political dynasty, a family dynasty. Perhaps the Republican Party will nominate one of his children, whatever next time we have an open Republican nomination. But I also think, and I've been mulling this over, I think there will be challengers. I think it will be competitive. There will be different people trying to take different aspects of Trumpism. Is it a J.D. Vance? Well, he has a policy apparatus. But I think the dark horse for the next open Republican nomination is Mark Wayne Mullen, the senator from Oklahoma, the guy who's challenging the union representatives to wrestle matches in the Senate chambers. Because that's what the people want, right? Yes. And I'm also, another dark horse, keep your eye on Pat McAfee, the sports journalist and WWE commentator. He'll make a move for politics. That's what the people want. So I think you're going to have someone who can marry that sense of power, celebrity, personality with the issues that were talked about in the first presentation.
J.D. Vance, if J.D. Vance beats Mark Wayne Mullen in a wrestling match, does he get the nomination? Because that's best of both
He's
worlds.
not going to beat McAfee in a wrestling match.
Well, Mark Wayne was a UFC fighter. Did you know that? Yeah. I got my eye on him. You heard it here. You heard it here first.
Yeah. Libby, no, that's not. Yeah, Libby. Did I get that right? Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Brooks, you talked about the waves of optimism and pessimism within the conservative community. Do you think that's reflective of waves of authoritarianism and democratization globally?
Yes. It's interesting to me that we always think ideas have consequences, ideas drive history, but a lot of time emotional moods drive history. And a guy comes along and says, everything is terrible, I alone can save it. Well, authoritarian feeds off that kind of sense that things are so terrible, we need an asshole. And we need that asshole. And authoritarian traditionally also feeds off something we have a lot of in America, which is a sense of social isolation and a need for belonging and a need for a hero figure to which you can show abeyance. And so I think Trump plays on both those psychological states.
Michael Peeler.
This is, I think, mostly to Helen, but I think all of you could probably answer it. My phone tells me there's an election 251 days from now. Is that going to be a divergence point? If Trump wins or Trump loses, will that change the course of American conservatism? Or does Trumpism have to be winnable to actually continue on this path? Does it have too much velocity behind it? Is it going to be dominant, or will the election have an outcome?
Good question. All of it. My prediction now is that Trump will win. I think I think the polls say that that's likely to happen now. If he doesn't, I don't think the old guard will come back. I think the next nominee 4 years later will still be in a Trumpist vein, because Matt is right that there are some electoral challenges facing a Republican Party that wants to embrace immigration restrictionism, because then you're going to lose some of the donors, and that's a problem. And there's a balancing act there, and there's some challenges. But we got one thing going for us, which is that the only thing less popular than our brand of conservatism is the Nikki Haley warmed over Bushism, which has a constituency of 12 people, and they all work at AEI.
Well, I mean, 40% in South Carolina is not nothing. This is a deep red state, and she got 40%. Now, I'm not totally disagreeing with you, but I think some of us who watch the state a lot were kind of surprised that she got 40%.
You got an open primary, right?
Barely, but yes, it is. Yeah. Oh, the case isn't closed on that. Okay.
I just want to say that Trump doesn't drive away just the donors. That's not why the Republican Party is losing elections. Trump drives away college-educated suburbanites who were the anchor of the Republican majorities from 52 all the way up to 2004. That's who he drives away. You're not going to have a majority party without those suburbanites.
But do you see a non-populist, the foundation for a non-populist Republican candidacy?
I do. I mean, I think even Nikki Haley was assimilating some of the lessons of the Trump years, right? I mean, you wrote in your column, she was pretty tough on immigration, on illegal immigration, right? I think you see with Ron DeSantis, right? You saw another possible stage of what Trump-inflected politics could be. So I think there will be many different candidates who take different lessons from the Trump phenomenon. But I don't think they will all be uniformly against American international leadership and American assistance to allies that had been invaded. I don't think they will be all against total 10% global tariff, okay, and or rather, for against. And I don't think they'll all be for complete shutdown of legal immigration in addition to illegal immigration.
I would just say that I think one of the other messages that the Republican Party will take from the Trump years is that you don't have to be pro-life, not for real. Trump's proved that. He has said maybe he would sign a 16-week abortion ban. 93% of abortions occur by week 16. He called a 6-week abortion ban a terrible idea, and he wins in a romp. At a time when Ohio, Kansas, other states have demonstrated the unpopularity of that view, and I think he's proven, and I think his legacy ultimately will be that he destroyed the pro-life movement. In the strangest irony of the president who appointed the justices overturned Roe, without people realizing that that's only one step in achieving a pro-life result, because you still then need to enact state laws. And I think his legacy will ultimately be that he destroyed the pro-life movement.
Oh, my, that's a takeaway from tonight. Yes, sir. I don't know your name, so please introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Joseph Kozak. Hey, if we're okay, I'm gonna move away from populism a little bit. and I'm wondering what y'all's thoughts are about because I feel like there's a general perception, at least, that everything's going bad, that we're heading in the wrong direction, that, like you said, pessimism, and I'm wondering why that is. I'm wondering if there's something that's leading the people, maybe the magazine or the column that you work for, maybe it's kind of people just waking up, but like why?
Who wants to take that? Helen, you're not so pessimistic.
Yeah.
Tell them that you're not pessimistic.
Yeah, I'm not well placed to answer that question because I don't feel pessimistic. And I will take this opportunity to agree with David. He said that his embrace of a belief in the value of American manufacturing has made him more pro Biden. I give Joe Biden credit for maintaining his commitment to reshoring American manufacturing. I think there are some he's had to do some favors for his left wing coalition in the way he's gone about it, but overall, the fact that the consensus on the Democratic side is that manufacturing is important and we need to bring it back, I think that achievement is in some. I think Trump should get a little bit of credit for having brought that issue back, but I also give them credit for having stuck with it.
What do you think about Matt Martin's comment about the pro-life movement? I wanted to hear you respond to that.
Saying that the man who led directly to the overturning of Roe v. Wade destroyed the pro-life movement is too many layers of irony for my head to wrap around. The fact that the pro-life movement was not completely prepared for the opportunity that he created for us, that's not his fault.
Okay.
If I could take a stab at the pessimism question.
Yeah.
9% of the country thinks we're headed in the right track. So that's pretty pessimistic. That's like historically low levels of optimism. And so I ascribe partly my business. And so once the internet kicked in, we realized that in order to generate headlines, we had to generate fear and hate. And so the number of headlines that communicate fear and hate has doubled since the internet began. So there's just a lot of negativity flowing out there. There's a lot of partisanship. We've been through a pretty rough period. And, I'll reel off statistics from my social science wannabe self. The mental health depression rates are up by 30%, teen suicide rate 58%. The number of Americans who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50% since 2000. The number of Americans who say they have no close friends is up 4 times since 2000. So there's some sort of social and emotional breakdown. The most serious piece of which is that if you ask people 2 generations ago, do you trust your neighbors? 60% said yes. And now it's 30% and 19% of millennials. So you can have a good economy, and I think we do have a fantastic economy. I think we are just zooming ahead of where Europe is. I think real wages are growing, manufacturing jobs are increasing, blah, blah, blah. But if people feel their social lives and emotional lives and spiritual lives are a wreck, they're going to feel pretty shitty. And they're not going to distinguish finally but how it is. They just think things are messed up. And then they look at the public debate, which is filled with vitriol, and they think, well, that seems kind of poisonous. So I think the social and emotional health of the country and the lack of trust is poison to everything else. And that is a genuine, real problem.
One last question in the back there. Then maybe Maddox, if it's really fast. Yes, sir. Yeah, you are in the back row. There's nobody behind you.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question more about international relations since I'm a foreign student and seeing the development of American politics. I just wanted to ask how seriously, this is a question for all of you, how serious does conservatism in America take the idea of the world moving into multipolarity, right? With China, with Russia, the changes that we have in sub-Saharan Africa, with the many changes we have in Latin America with figures like Milei and Bukele and many other leaders. How serious does conservatism take the idea that maybe this free market, optimist conservatism is moving towards very different ideas of how the world should be run into? Thank you.
Well, I think for much of the history I write about in my book, Americans resisted the idea of multipolarity. American conservatives believed that in bipolarity for much of the Cold War, that it was a contest between the United States and our allies and the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, there was a move toward unipolarity, the idea that America was the global superpower and America should lead efforts to not only be the guarantor of international security, but also to further the spread of democracy that David mentioned. Now, since the financial crisis, since the recognition of the China threat, there's a debate within the Republican Party. Should the Republican Party and the conservative movement continue to embrace the idea of American primacy, American global leadership? Or do we need to restrain ourselves, reduce our commitments in order to prepare for this more multipolar landscape that you describe? And here too, the debate is ongoing. And the debate over aid to Ukraine, that is part of this question of multipolarity. And as the party split down the middle. Two more Republican senators voted against Ukraine aid, the national security bill, than for it. And I believe that if Speaker Johnson allowed the national security bill to come to the floor, the Republican conference would be split a little bit more against, but there would still be Republicans for aid to Ukraine. So that's the debate line in the Republican Party right now.
Maddox, last question if it's really fast.
Should be.
Okay.
Seeing I'm the last person asking a question, just wanted to thank you guys for coming out here and giving this wonderful panel to us. But do Americans want a stronger head of state right now or a stronger head of government? This may hurt Brooks' argument and strengthen Miss Andrews' argument, but I'm interested in what you guys have to say.
The problem in America is we don't divide the roles. The president is both the head of state and the head of government. And so this is why I think I think Obama and Trump, they both would have been very good heads of state. They go to all the official functions. They go, they do the interviews, right? They go to the ribbon cuttings. But as a critic of Obama, I was not very happy with the way he governed. And Trump's governance, while I supported many of his initiatives, it was incoherent, it was chaotic. But with the American president, it's a 2-for-1 deal. You have both the head of government and the head of state in one person.
That's a good place to end. Thank you very much. As we wrap up this evening, I have one more thing to say. As we wrap up this evening, let me invite you to tomorrow's public event, which will be held here in the Watkins Room at 5 p.m. We will hear this time from David Brooks and from Matt Continetti, and then put the panel back together, and we'll have another interesting discussion. So tomorrow night here at 5 p.m. Now let's show our appreciation to our panelists. And you are all dismissed.